machine gun the bullet came out of.
All we did was much about.
You've given a bit of basic drill, given a rifle, a little bit of target practice, and then I was allocated a lorry, and that lorry you kept all the time.
What we used to do was learn each other's jobs on an MTV. I could fire a gun, strip it down, put it back. I could cox a boat. I know everything about a boat.
Well, Jack seems to be having a pretty exciting time at sea. There's no doubt he's doing his bit all right. Here we are at home, nice and comfortable, sitting round the fireside. Do you know, it makes me feel I'm not pulling my weight in this war.
By May 1940, things looked bleak in Europe, as Hitler's army unleashed devastating attacks on France, Belgium and the Netherlands.
In May, the action really began. The Germans moved forward, and so did the British Expeditionary Force move forward to meet them at a pre-arranged point in Belgium. But they hadn't been allowed into Belgium up to this point. The idea was Belgium was staying neutral and would only get involved if it was attacked. So once the Germans moved into Belgium, so the British Expeditionary Force and the French moved forward from their lines in France forward into Belgium to meet them.
First place we went to was Brussels, and the street we were in was empty. It had been completely evacuated. The civilians had just gone.
We got on the train in Antwerp and it wouldn't move, so we got off and we walked from Belgium to France. We walked all that way.
It's a beautiful day, lovely sunny sky, little white clouds, and we was in this French village. And I was walking across the square, and out of a white cloud came a German fighter, swooped down a machine gun at me. But he was a rotten shot, he missed me.
When Germany started the Blitzkrieg, the 10th of May, that's when we first met up with the Germans.
Went all the way along the River Dial, and the Germans were on the other side, firing at our guns, and we were firing at their guns. So we had a Lysander up there sending the information to me, and I informed the army. So eventually got their target and shot their aircraft down.
What was expected really was a standoff, like the First World War, a war of attrition, a war of very little movement. People thought they would be ending up in their own trenches, facing the Germans in their trenches, because that's what they were used to. But that's not what happened, because the Germans mounted this incredibly audacious attack through the Ardennes, using their Panzer tanks, and it just cut through the defences. People didn't think they could get through a forest area with a tank, but the fact was they did. And there were virtually no defences behind it, so they went straight through. And in a matter of days, they had reached the coast.
We found ourselves at a town called WWII. These Stukas would circle up and then pick their target, and the leading one was to be diving down. Well, we discovered that if you fired, those who were circling could see the flash of the guns, and they would probably bomb you. So in the end, we used to wait until the last one was in his dive. He used to come almost vertically, and he couldn't alter it, and that's the one we used to shoot at. Shot one down anyway, that was quite satisfactory.
I heard that the Germans are 4 miles away, and I suddenly saw a roadblock, soldiers coming through. It was the Guards Brigade. I said, "What are you buggers doing?" He said, "We've been told to retire to Lille." I said, "Well, I've just left there." And he said, "Well, you better hang about and see what's going on." So my officer, he went and found out that we've got to move too. So from there we went to Arras, Amiens, and fought the Germans down there.
The Allied armies were hampered by poor communications. With no common leader, they often operated solely with their own objectives in mind.
We didn't know where we were going or what we were doing.
The lack of communication between the British and the French in the build-up to Dunkirk. Neither side really knew what the other was doing.
Sergeant Grover said, Harry, you put on that spot there with your gun, and if any tanks come into you with their guns pointing forward, they're enemy. If the guns are reversed, they are friendly. So I said, okay, Sarge. So I sat there with my gun, and I said, there's tanks coming, Sarge. He said, well, shoot the bastards then. I said, yeah, well, I can't see him. Oh, right, get on. So we carried on, and suddenly they started firing at us. Guns were blowing us to pieces. I thought, this is terrible. And then suddenly my gun was hit, and we were knocked out for a couple of minutes. And suddenly, Monsieur, we're so sorry, we thought you were the Germans. These are bloody Frenchmen in this tank as big as a house. But we got about 17 casualties then.
The lesson that was learned was that communication with their allies would have to be far, far better in future. And not only that, their communication amongst themselves would have to be better.
The Allied defenders were unable to match the sheer might and ferocity of the German blitzkrieg attack. Faced with superior air power and a more unified command, they were a poor match for the German Wehrmacht.
The German army was better equipped, it was most certainly better trained and more experienced.
All their armaments were better than ours. Their machine guns were better, their anti-tank guns were better, their tanks were better. Always one step ahead of what we got. They always had bigger tanks that could fire farther distances. They just stood out of range of ours and just knocked them out.
We had rifles, but they weren't good.
My weapon was a Webley 38. When it was time to fire them, it was time to get out of it, because you couldn't hit a barn door at 10 feet with them.
The defenses of Paris are airtight. Enemy planes will find a barrier of steel guarding the throbbing heart of France. The bitter lesson of 1914 has resulted in the famous Maginot Line. For mile after mile along France's eastern and northeastern frontier are lines of steel and concrete gun turrets, connected underground by vast subterranean chambers. Here, entire armies can be quartered in comfortable and air-conditioned surroundings. "They shall not pass" is the historic war cry of the French soldier, and the scissor-like crossfire of the Maginot Line makes doubly sure that the new World War will not be fought in France.
The Allies could do little to stem the advance of the enemy. In the town of Wormhout, 17 miles from Dunkirk, British troops were overrun by advancing German forces.
I saw the best and the worst of war. I had some wonderful friends, and my colleagues were so brave. There was 100 soldiers put in a barn as prisoners. So the Nazis came through one evening, and they machine gunned and shot every soldier in there. And these men were murdered, but fortunately, Pooley and Callahan were still alive under their bodies of their mates. And they stayed there with all their dead and dying, and those dear ladies, farmers' wives, put them in the grave.
I'll tell you one thing, not all Germans were bad, although we were trying to kill each other. And I don't suppose a lot of them wanted to be where they were any more than we did.
The funny thing is that I like the German people. They're a lovely lot of people. It was just these Nazi troops.
I saw plenty of Germans do, you might say, acts of mercy to wounded soldiers. They would always attend to them according to the severity of their wound, regardless of what uniform, whether it was grey or whether it was khaki. And we used to do the same.
You know, the ordinary German person, that's a bit of fight.
I always used to say to my men, if you take any prisoners, treat them as you would wish to be treated if the situation was reversed. I mean, after all, they were human beings.
As Hitler's forces moved through France at lightning speed, the Allies found themselves fighting against overwhelming odds.
You had to be disciplined. I didn't see any cowards.
Well, I only had one, he was a driver. I'm not going to tell you what his name was, but he was a proper ladies' man, with curly hair, with a little moustache, and his side cap on the side of his hat, and he was a boaster. We couldn't find this fella. He went missing, and I found him lying in a slit trench. So I said, like, where have you been? He said, I got lost. And I said, how did you get lost? Walking up in broad daylight behind someone else. But anyway, that was it. So I used to give him the least responsible job, which I thought wasn't quite fair. You know, the least dangerous job. I know you had a wife and daughter. I said, what will your family think when you're branded a coward? He said to me, I don't care what you say or do to me, he said, I'm not driving this carrier up that road. Well, the only thing you could do was to stop their pay. Not that we got much anyway. And I wouldn't have minded if he wasn't such a boaster. When he was out, oh, we did this, we did that. I said, you did nothing. You sick crap your pants. I don't know whether you call that trauma or what.
It would be several years after the events at Dunkirk that military psychiatry became an essential element of medical provision.
Those soldiers that come back from the front, I know exactly how they feel. I used to have a lot of flashbacks, but I never had any treatment or anything. I never bothered about counselling. You had to get on with it.
I didn't need counselling. May I say, the men of those days were a lot different than the men today.
Counselling, kick up the backside. Bloody counselling. It's a load of rubbish. There wasn't anyone to give them counselling. Well, not officially.
Outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered, the Allied defenders fought a desperate retreat as the Nazi war machine closed in.
Blitzkrieg operations of the Germans had effectively encircled the British Army in northern France.
The speed meant that they'd almost got to the point of cutting off any exit.
The effect of these tanks streaking through and reaching the coast meant that the British Expeditionary Force was effectively outflanked. It meant that even before the fighting had begun in any real sense, they already were on the back foot and they were going to have to retreat.
The British, from a purely pragmatic view, saw that the battle was lost. They knew it was going to end badly, and they thought the only way we can stay in the war is to get our men away, and then we can carry on the fight.
We knew things were boiling up, and the Germans came in one end and we went out the other. And the Germans circled us around. It happened so quickly. The only way out was by water.
And by that time, the word was Dunkirk. That was the only escape for the British soldier.
Along this road came this German staff car. The troll shot the driver, and the officer in the back jumped out and ran away. But he left behind in the car his helmet, his belt with his Luger, and a briefcase. That was immediately taken to the divisional headquarters, and they realised this briefcase contained the plans for the German corps that was to attack Dunkirk.
There were 2 days' grace which allowed the French citizens to get out of Dunkirk itself, because it had been bombed heavily, and the French soldiers barricade it so that they could defend it.
The situation was rapidly becoming desperate. German tanks had reached the Channel coast. The Maginot Line had been outflanked. With the French and Belgian armies retreating on each side, there was only one option for the BEF: withdrawal to Dunkirk.
I'm driving along this very twisty road, and there was a bridge that had been hit and the road was completely blocked. You couldn't get through. So I stopped, and while I was looking at the map, I suddenly saw someone coming up with a revolver in his hand. So I grabbed my rifle ready to shoot, and then realised it was a British officer. He said, "Where are you making for?" And I said, "That little village." He said, "Well, good job for you that the bridge is down because the Germans are in charge of that village." And he said, "In case you don't know, you're encircled, so make for the beach." So I drove back to where my company was, but they'd gone.
Montgomery was able to shift my division to fill up the gap where the German panzers were going to come through. So we got to the Comines Canal, where we took up position just in time before the Germans arrived the other side. We were there for about 5 days holding them back while the rest were getting away from Dunkirk. On the last night, the Germans got around us, so it was decided someone had to go back to our headquarters and tell them what was happening. So I volunteered. So I ran up to this farm, and on guard outside was a friend of mine, and he shot me from a few feet, but it wasn't serious. It went through my right shoulder. He thought I was a German, and he said, "I'm sorry." He said, I aimed for your head." Well, it was only a few feet from me. I said, "It's a bloody good job you were a rotten shot then, isn't it, John?"
Defeated and humiliated, the Allies were backed into a corner. Surrender seemed inevitable. The war for Europe was assumed to be won.
This incredible defeat, because that's what it was a huge defeat, looked as though it would wipe out the British army. If the army was outflanked already, all the Germans had to do was to curve round and it would be completely surrounded. And if it was completely surrounded, how on earth could it possibly do anything but surrender?
We heard from the general that they could not help us. I knew we'd lost the war.
You thought, well, they're going to invade Britain now, and that's it.
I didn't know how we could possibly win at that stage. We'd lost everything, the whole British Army, all its equipment.
Amid the unfolding chaos, the BEF headed for Dunkirk.
As the British Army moved back, it became fairly clear to Lord Gort, he was the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, that if Britain was going to survive in the war, there would have to be some kind of evacuation. And it became very clear that evacuation could only take place through Dunkirk, because bit by bit all the other ports came into German hands. The only one that was still in Allied hands was Dunkirk. Now the British soldiers, they didn't know why they were retreating.
We didn't know what was happening. It was dark. We just walked and walked and walked to Bray Dunes. Eventually we decided to walk to where that smoke was coming from, Dunkirk.
They were sent into the retreat thinking maybe my unit's done something wrong and we're being punished and we're being sent back. They didn't realise for a long time that they had been completely outflanked themselves. And so back they came.
We got through and I said, "Oh, come on, Ken, jump up." I got a lovely big horse. I put him on board. I said, "We're going to have a ride on this." We started the ride. I said, "No, we can't do that. That whole horse is going to get killed. Come on, off you get. Let's go back." Then we walked, and that was it.
We handed over to French troops to hold the Germans back while we got away, so we drove to the outskirts of Le Pen, and we were told there was someone there that would meet us and tell us where to go. As we got there, was no one there. So we walked into the sea. I remember the water was about up to my chest. Over came the Luftwaffe, machine gunning along the beach. There were no ships, no boats at all there, so they took us out the water. It was decided that each machine gun crew would find their own way.
We came across a farm and the farmer came out and said, "Are you staying?" And we said, "Well, we're moving slowly." And he said, "Well, here's the key of my house." He said, "Look after it as long as you can, because I'm going and leaving everything behind." And then the signal came through, evacuate, so we evacuated, and that was the end of that.
We were 3 weeks on the road. We were in the farmyard with all the animals. All we could help ourselves. Went into the nest boxes, but we couldn't drink the water. We couldn't drink nothing. We could have nothing to drink.
I hadn't got any food, no water, nothing. And I said, "Oh, Ebby," I said, "what are we going to do?" He said, "Harry, there's an old bullock there." He said, "We're going to shoot him up." He'd go, "Ooh." I could hear him moaning, poor old thing. So we shot him, and he cut some joints of beef off him, and we had steak and thick. My God.
We did eventually meet the soldiers. We were with the Cheshire Regiment. They were very good. They fed us. We had a lot of biscuits, hard crust things. Horrible.
With the enemy on their heels, the retreating army continued to the coast.
We were told that if you find a forces shop, just go in and help yourself because the Germans will have everything. So I went in there and I got some cigarettes, and my co-driver, who'd never driven the lorry, he got some whiskey. He was a Scotsman. He was in the back of the lorry, drunk. And that was the last I saw of him until I got to the beach.
As thousands of defenseless civilians fled for their lives, the soldiers witnessed scenes of countless horrors.
There were so many refugees on the road, and they just wanted to get out of the way. So this really hampered the British retreat, because they were retreating alongside hundreds of thousands, millions of civilians who were also trying to get away. So it's chaos. You know, the roads are chaos. The whole atmosphere is one of chaos. What is going to happen? Nobody knew.
We had to keep going, but the French did suffer. We saw some terrible things there, terrible. The dead bodies on the side. It was terrible.
The terrible sights we used to see of hundreds of people being murdered and bombed and blown up.
All these refugees with prams and horses and carts, and of course the Luftwaffe, they were machine gunning to cause chaos and block the roads.
I'd just bomb anything.
They didn't care. We went through so much death, rotting bodies, men, soldiers, horses, cattle, everything. It was absolutely dreadful.
We saw an officer laid out. He was dead, lying on. I said to him, and all his little photographs were hanging out of his children and everything.
Despite the horrors, the soldiers had no choice but to keep moving.
People try and help me. It was a fiasco, absolutely a fiasco. When I saw those poor dads being blown to pieces, and you just ignore it. You just ignore it. You know it's happened and it's gone.
It's really terrible to see these women and children being injured and that, but there's not much we could do about it, like, you know.
We couldn't save anybody when you're going through on an action. You despair, and you did your best, but you know you had a job to do.
There was a little boy came home from school and he found his house had been bombed and his mother and father were killed, and he said, "Where's my mummy?" Then he followed the soldiers with us.
They got little carts and bikes and prams. I can remember when we did nothing but do peasants' feet. The feet got bad and our medic bound them up.
My feet were terrible. The soldiers kept putting me on their backs because I couldn't walk anymore. I was only a little kid. Oh, it was awful. Well, my father gave up. He didn't want to. He said, "I'm not going any further." He said, "The Bosch can have me."
Deep in a complex of tunnels beneath Dover Castle, the British began to formulate Operation Dynamo.
The person with the overall control of the evacuation was Admiral Bertram Ramsay, who was a trusted old naval hand and who was put in an extraordinarily difficult situation. He was working from Dover Castle, in fact working from the dynamo room.
The message came through here that Operation Dynamo was to commence.
Things had to be done so quickly. You hadn't got weeks to plan what to do. It had to be done immediately.
The recovery was no ordinary military operation. Admiral Ramsay devised an evacuation involving over 900 vessels.
The port of Dunkirk had been almost completely destroyed by the Luftwaffe.
It was almost unusable. So all you had was the beaches.
The trouble was, the ships were too large to come in close to the beaches. The beaches were very, very shallow.
It was a flat, vast, duney beach, which is great if you want to sunbathe, but if you're trying to get large destroyers up to it and get men off the beach, it's impossible, and that is what they found.
What was needed were smaller boats that could actually ferry the soldiers from the beaches to the larger naval and civilian ships offshore.
The British government appealed for small civilian craft to join the rescue mission. The operation would become the biggest evacuation in military history.
Desperate times call for desperate measures.
It came out by radio to begin with, and that was it. That's all people knew.
It wasn't until very late on in the evacuation that the newspapers and the radio even reported that there was an evacuation. It was kept secret.
It was all done in such a rush, the requirement to requisition the vessels sort of came overnight. It was organised chaos, and everybody who could lend a hand lent a hand.
A lot of the time, the owners had no idea that their boats were being taken.
If the owner happened to be nearby, then they could join in with the project. If not, the Navy basically went along and just took them.
Arriving at the outskirts of Dunkirk, many of the exhausted soldiers had not eaten for days.
I drove 48 hours, kept falling asleep at the wheel, hitting the curb, waking up, and eventually arrived at the beach.
I went into a cafe and asked if we could have some water in our bottles because we'd had no drink. And the lady said, "I'm sorry, we've got no water in Dunkirk. The Germans have blown up the waterworks." She said, "But I will fill it with Van Rouge for me." So we had Van Rouge for the beach.
I said, "Look at that warehouse over there. Look, it's empty. There's nobody there." I said, "Give me your rifle." So I got his rifle, and I bang, 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 about 5 shots with it, opened the door. And when I opened up this door, you would never believe this, it was full of neat Jamaica rum, loads of carnation milk, biscuits, everything you wanted was going to be left for the Germans.
Dunkirk was a military disaster. The loss of equipment to the British Army was colossal.
The soon as they got to Dunkirk, the soldiers were surprised to hear that they were going to have to blow up their cars, their tanks, anything that they'd travelled in to get there.
The vast majority of the equipment that the British Army had taken to France with them was lost. All their heavy artillery, virtually all their vehicles, all those had to be abandoned in France because they couldn't get them back across the Channel.
They were told to put sand into the tanks so that the engine would completely seize up, because they didn't want the Germans to have any of their equipment. But as every soldier has drummed into him, they didn't leave their rifles behind.
You put on a charge if you lose the rifle. That was more valuable to them than your life. My 1500-weight van went into the canal with my kit bag, camera, with some films that would be worth a fortune now. We smashed up all the lorries and we couldn't take them to England.
We took our machine guns out the lorry, drove the lorries over the machine guns so they were destroyed, then cut all the pipes on the lorries and left them running, but they'd seize up.
We just got to smash everything up, pour all the petrol into the water. Didn't like doing it.
There was a big hotel on the seafront. We went down into the cellar. We dived in, you know, and we saw other people in there. And this woman, she said, don't bother, she said, come in, she said. And there was beds there and we laid there for a while, you know, it was all right, but we couldn't go to the toilet or anything. We had a machine gun on the top where they were firing, keep the enemy away, but it didn't seem to make any difference. You couldn't do anything with money. There was money lying in the street, useless.
After we got to the beach, the lieutenant said to me, "You're Air Force and these are all Army, and if they get hold of you, you'll get beaten up." Because they could see no support from the air. He said, "Well, what you'll have to do, take your shoes off and put some boots on, a Macintosh and a tin hat." So I was completely disguised as an army chap.
As tens of thousands of soldiers congregated on the sands at Dunkirk, they were confronted with scenes of destruction they would never forget.
It was all on fire down the beach.